Okay, I'm going to start off with introductions. I know that people are still joining the live chat, but I'll start off with introductions, and hopefully by the time I'm done, there'll be more people in the room. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third live stream panel of Read for Action, the Humanitarian Book Club on Climate, Conflict, and Humanitarian Crisis. Read for Action is a project at the intersection of public humanities, environmental humanities, and public advocacy and policy change, based at the University of Virginia's Humanitarian Collaborative and in partnership with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It launched at the Global Climate Conference COP27 in Egypt in November. My name is Ruth Mukwana, a Senior Humanitarian Affairs Officer with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, creator and host of the podcast Stories in Humanitarian Action, and a fiction writer, and co-collaborator of Read for Action, working with Adrian Galley, a collaborative practitioner fellow at the University of Virginia, a visiting scholar in the Department of English, and a primary architect of Read for Action, along with Professor Kirsten Gersdorf, the director of the Humanitarian Collaborative at UVA's Batten School of Public Policy. Our students and postdoc researchers are Noah Strike, Nasima Mohammed, Leslie Wazo, Mary Margaret Lear, and Lily Silko Torutova. I want to thank our partners who make this project possible. We are supported by the UN Strategic Communications Branch team, Kirsten Mildren, Harriet Butterfield, Thomas DeMol, and Doa, as well as our advisory board members drawn from the New York Review of Books, the Philippines-based NGO Local Club, UNICEF Somalia, and the UVA Environmental Resilience Institute. Read for Action is made possible by funding and support from the UN, the Environmental Resilience Institute, the Humanitarian Collaborative, Environmental Humanities at UVA Brown College, and the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, which is also hosting this event. Thank you to Isabel, Sam Jacob, and Anne Gilliam for organization and technical assistance for today's events. Before I introduce our panelists today, I want to speak briefly about why we created Read for Action, and for those just joining us, how it works. Our project responds directly to an urgent challenge of humanitarian public advocacy now: how to increase and sustain public engagement on humanitarian crises, which are intensified and compounded by the climate crisis and intertwined with environmental justice issues. You can find more information on our website, which is readforaction.org. I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today. Imbola Mbuwe is the author of the New York Times bestseller Behold the Dreamers, which won the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction and was an Oprah's Book Club selection. The novel has been adapted into an opera and a stage play and optioned for a miniseries. Her second novel, How Beautiful We Were, about a fictional African village's fight against an American oil company, was named by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of 2021. Her works have been translated into 18 languages and published in dozens of countries. A native of Limbe, Cameroon, and a graduate of Rutgers and Columbia Universities, Mbuwe lives in New York. Dr. Jamila Mahmood is a medical professional with more than 2 decades experience managing crises in health, disasters, and conflict settings. She's currently professor and executive director of the newly established Sunway Center for Planetary Health at Sunway University in Malaysia. She has held advisory roles in the Malaysian Climate Action Council, the Consultative Council for Foreign Policy, and is currently a member of the Advisory Council at the Ministry of Health, Malaysia. She is a strong advocate of planetary health and sustainability and actively advises on environment, social, and governance in the advisory and board roles she holds. Olufemi Tawo is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. His theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social sciences, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophies, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in several journals and magazines, and he is the author of Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations. Again, welcome to the live chat today, and I will just jump in with the questions. One of the questions that we are all interested in is, why is the novel and narrative fiction a valuable culture form for connecting readers to humanitarian crisis? And I'll start off with you, Mbolu, if that's okay.
Hi, Ruth. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. So why is the novel? Well, I guess I write novels, so that is the way I do it best. I have to confess that before writing this novel, I didn't think much about environmental issues or about climate change. Even though as a child, I was aware of what was happening in Nigeria. So when I was a teenager, there was a famous Nigerian environmentalist named Ken Saro-Wiwa who was hanged to death. And that was an incident that really, really, really upset me. And it stayed with me and it bothered me for many years. And I guess it was really very far in my subconscious, because it was only after when I started writing this novel that I started thinking about how Saro-Wiwa's death and other environmental issues that I came to learn about all over the world, how they got me thinking. But because I was always fascinated with activism, right? I grew up in the 90s in Africa. I grew up at the time where, you know, the revolutionaries were celebrated. I mean, when I was a child, we were still talking about Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. All of, you know, Nelson Mandela came out of prison when I was, you know, in middle school. So the novel was for me a way of sort of going behind the scenes at activism, because I have never been part of it. So, you know, probably, you know, Jamila and Femi didn't probably know more about it because this is, you know, what they do. But for me, I was more somebody who looked at these people from a distance and thought, what is it like? Right? What is it like to be part of that, of such a movement? What is it like to dedicate your life to a cause? And so why a novel? Well, because the novel allowed me to go behind the scenes. It allowed me to sort of be part of something that I otherwise wouldn't be a part of, because I never, for whatever reason, I was just never part of anything of that nature. So people ask me all the time, you know, are you Tula? No, I'm not Tula. There's no way. I mean, Tula and I couldn't be more night and day. It more came out of my fascination with the work that other people are doing, and how much reverence I had for people like that. And writing a novel was sort of a way to pay homage to them, and also to get to like sort of follow them around and see what it's like for them.
Thank you for that, Mbolu. And Jamila, what is your take on this question?
Well, the first thing I want to say to Mbolu is thank you for writing this book. And how uncanny is it that we are discussing it today on the day that the UNFCCC report was released, telling us that we're in such dangerous territory right now. So, you know, it really hits home, doesn't it? I mean, yeah. So for me, you know, a novel is such a nice way to relate serious issues in a way that evokes emotional response. And I think that, you know, as human beings, we do need that mind-heart connection for anything to actually start, working, right? People make decisions a lot of the time with their heads, but, the heart plays a really important role. And I think your book has been able to bring that, in a very humane and human perspective that, all of us can relate to, because the news is all around us on the challenges that we are facing with, with climate change, with pollution, and I think it's so important, a book. So I think, as someone who's been involved, not just in the humanitarian sector, but also as a health practitioner, it becomes also real, and that, 7 to 9 million people are dying from air pollution, and it's a silent killer that we don't talk about, right? People die from COVID, and of course, it's not nice for anyone to die from any particular disease, but the fact is that there are the people are not marching out to say, why haven't governments done something about this? When, there was so much anger with the management of the pandemic and so forth, right? And it seems that no matter how loud we shout about the fossil fuel industry, they are getting stronger and stronger. And, all the global processes that are happening today are really, they're the strongest lobby there. So, so it's so, it hits home today, because when the UNFCCC report comes out, and we're heading to another COP, it tells us that, what games are being played out there and how do we win this? And it requires all of us to really rethink about how we live. So it is a serious issue. And the book just exemplifies the humanness of fragility of people who are being, stuck in the middle of that crisis, right? Being poisoned each day against their will.
Thank you for that, Jamila. And Femi.
Yeah, I want to echo Jamila's thanks of this. There's a lot about it that I found valuable and helpful. I'm sure over the next hour we'll talk a lot about it, but I actually want to start with that. I think Jamila queued up really nicely just now, which is to kind of tell a human story about, a human affecting emotional story about these things that we talk about in the abstract a lot. And one part of why that's helpful is you relate to people, you relate to characters in a different way than you relate to abstract ideas. But I think that's helpful about the form is that you make connections that you might not otherwise make. So I think something that is maybe more obvious, I'm Nigerian American, bro, you're Cameroonian, so we know the story of Ogoniland and Shell, we know the connection of violence and organized violence, military violence to the global economy. But I'm not sure it's something that everyone everywhere necessarily thinks of when they think about fossil fuels or petroleum. They might think that the corruption down to lobbying or maybe false advertising, but this military element is not something that people necessarily think of first. I think that was a really valuable point in the book. So just as Jamila said, this is the day that the UNFCCC's, the big reports has come out about climate change and where climate change is. But this is also the anniversary of the United States invasion of Iraq. And I think, it's important to think about both of those things. There were a lot of people that, the death toll is in hundreds of thousands, the people displaced. And the only winners from that war, as far as I can tell, are Halliburton and the defense contractors and so on and so forth. So the connection between military organized violence and all this other stuff, I think is something that comes out in the book as we're about to talk about, is of the things that I think is helpful about this form.
Thank you. And I saw a lot of nodding there as you were speaking, Femi, as well. And so, Mbolo, I'm sure some of our people on the chat are disappointed you're not Tula.
yeah. No, I don't. That I'm quite the opposite of Tula.
But the book, and already listening to Jamila, listening to Femi, they're talking about some of the themes that the book does so well. And so the question, I'm curious is, when you were writing the book, it's also been described as a book about environmental justice that exposes the human cost of capitalism, the violence that Femi is talking about, bring up humanness and all of this. And Jamila is nicely linking it already to the new report on climate change. But what is this book about for you? When you started writing it, did you have these themes at the back of your mind? What is it that sparked you to write the book? What kind of research did you undertake? What kind of themes, if any at all, did you have in mind?
Right. So I think that is, to me, that is the beauty of literature, is that I don't have to write about any themes. I write about people. And I think Jamila mentioned this, that, it's one thing to hear on the news, right? This many thousand people died in Iraq, like Femi said, or this many people are died in the Niger Delta, and Ecuador, Afghanistan, wherever there's this kind of situation. But there's a whole other thing to know the stories of those people. And that is what concerns me, is the story of those people. Who are these people? What are their dreams? What do they wish for? I mean, obviously they wish to live in a clean environment. Who doesn't wish to live in a clean environment? But my goal, my hope, I'm writing this book, was to give an honest portrayal of these people, of what it's like to live in such an environment, of what it's like when your back is against the wall. When the novel starts, the people, they make a decision to do something because they are pretty much powerless, and a madman pushes them to do something pretty radical. And I also wanted to sort of, explore humans within all their complexity, right? Because this is not a story about, oh, look at the good, innocent people who are being destroyed by capitalism, or look at the awful oil corporation. No, humans are complex on all levels. And so my hope was to tell a story about people. But of course, this is not happening in a vacuum, right? In the process of telling it, I have to come face to face and talk about how, colonialism happened to this village, and globalization happened, and capitalism happened, and dictatorship happened. Everything happened there. But my duty as a writer was not to write about the issues, is to say, look at how it is to live in this environment, and look at what is this when your life is affected by all of these issues, which they don't really have much control over. Like, they don't even understand globalization and how much it affects their life. That is, a different level for them, but still it is a part of their lives. So I think the one thing that helped me was that I didn't have an agenda. I never came to this thinking, oh, I'm going to make this point or another. I think that is why I love when people who do this work, they talk to me about it, because they're the ones who have a mission more than me. I think my mission was just to honestly tell the story and to do justice to all the characters. So even though, of course, as a human, I am very much against all such things, but I cannot let that agenda take over the storytelling, right? I have to put my judgments aside and just focus on just presenting the story to the reader.
Right. And in fact, I think you did such a fantastic job. One of the readers on Discord did say, in fact, he wanted to find out if the story came from your personal experiences, because they were so portrayed in such a rich and relatable way. Yeah,
no, I mean, thankfully, I have never lived in such an environment. So that is not anywhere for my life. The only thing that I would say is for my life is the fact that I grew up in a town that had an oil refinery. So as a child, I was very aware of the politics of oil, and probably why the Ken Saro-Wiwa, hanging was very, very disturbing to me, because I understood the oil and how oil enriched certain peoples and not others. But no, outside of that, I can't say it was very much tied to my life. I mean, like Tula, the only thing I have in Tula is that we both came to America at 17 to go to college. Tula became an activist, and I sat in my dormitory room watching movies with my friends. That's about how much similarity there is. So no, I mean, this is not drawn from my life. This was a lot of research, so I should be honest about that. I looked at lots and lots of different situations all over the world. The Niger Delta was a good one, right? BP oil spill, Standing Rock, Flint, Michigan, for those of us in America, with the water being poisoned and the children drinking poisoned water. I looked at what is happening in Ecuador with Chevron and, the Lago Agrio region. These stories are happening all over the world. So I did a lot of research. I did a lot of research on activists and environmentalists. I read a lot of history and biographies and memoirs of dissidents. So a lot of it was examining other people's lives and sort of creating the character of Tula and the village of Kusawa based on those different accounts.
Right. And you mentioned activism there, and Jamila, again, one of the big themes, at least for me and many of the readers in the book, is about activism and activism of this community. And I'm so glad, Mboli, also say, this is not a community sitting there, playing, not playing, but feeling or describing themselves as victims. And they're very much involved in wanting to bring about change. The youth are very involved, the elders, everyone is involved. And I'm just a question for you, Jamila. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about this, because again, maybe when you put on your humanitarian hat, we've been talking about, empowering communities. I don't even know if that's the right word, but we do want communities to be in charge of their destiny and not, getting expatriates and foreigners to come and kind of take over. But I don't think we are doing a very good job of it. And I just wanted to see, hear, listen to you, share a bit from your experience. And also, what can we do to really make this a reality? Jamila, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ruth. As you know, I was involved in the preparations for the summit, and these were the right questions that you asked, that we also asked people. I think the first thing to recognize is people have agency and power. It's whether we give them the space to exert that power. And I think, where activism happens, the challenge is the power imbalance that exists. And in the humanitarian sector and the development sector as well, to an extent, is that power imbalance is real. And it is just so hard to shift. So the rhetoric is there, the whole thing about localization or giving, the right to local actors to play their role and to lead and to not just to participate, but to lead, right? But until and unless that power imbalance is resolved, so it's the same thing with with Paxton and the people of Kusawa. They have agency, and but the power dynamic is just so stark, not just the oil company, but it's also the government and others who are supposed to liberate them so that they can actually exert that power. So I think, we have, the humanitarian sector, humanitarians really have to, I don't know what it will take, maybe a novel to really point to the ugliness of a sector that is actually meant to be life-saving. And how do we break this power dynamic that is so apparent, that doesn't allow locals and communities to exert their leadership? Maybe that moment of madness, maybe we need a conga, right? And it required some degree of madness to break that power dynamic. what would that look like in the humanitarian sector, I wonder? And I see the oil companies as the donors, who are there perpetuating this power dynamic. So I think it's very complex. So your next book, Embolo.
Thank you.
But one of my favorite characters is, in fact, my favorite character is Conga. But now that Embolo, you brought him up already. Jamila, you brought him up again. And for me, I'm just gonna ask you, do we need a Conga to really make a shift? I know your own work is really in the social justice space. You've been looking at reparations. I'm really interested in also trying, from your own, the book itself is not on climate change, but extractive industry and how that also impacts the environment. But I wonder if there are any parallels, if any, that can be applied from your work to, extractive industries. And I'm asking too many questions of you here, but, do we need another kind of madness to actually really shift? I know, Jamila, you said earlier, with the fossil industry, there's been so much focus, there's been so much advocacy, activism, but there's really no shift at all.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I thought a lot about the character of Conga, what the lesson is for those of us trying to shift things. And one of the things, it's we have a treat. We actually have the author here, so she can tell me if I'm off base here. But I actually thought, Conga's the sane person here. Conga's the person who remembers, well, maybe that's a little too stark, but, you need somebody like Conga who's willing to deviate from what other people are doing. I think we usually think of that as, madness, and in many contexts it is. But what's different about the climate scenario, what's different about climate politics, is that the status quo is very measurably madness, right? There's, the report today is just the latest of a long line of reports all saying if we continue to do as we're doing, we're going to destroy the planet, we're going to destroy our future as children. And it's not sane to continue doing that, or it's not the version of sanity I'm interested in. So do we need something outside of that? Yes. Does the thing outside of it, require, taking hostages or something? I don't know. But I think, the way I prefer to think about things, there are kinds of decision-making that are built into capitalism as we find it, when men with guns and behind them executives with C-suite positions and behind them shareholders get to decide whose water is polluted and who gets extracted from. That's the decision-making structure. That's an identifiable structural piece of how our world works. And we can imagine making those decisions differently. We don't even have to imagine, really. I'll just give 3 examples from different countries. In Brazil, the Workers' Party there started something they called participatory budgeting, letting people decide in a kind of town hall what they were going to do with city funds. In India, that has been institutionalized in the state of Kerala. They've built that into decision-making processes. So they've done that at a bigger scale than a city. And in Kenya, they had a social movement they called the Harambee movement, which has basically become a kind of quasi-formal institution where communities get to weigh in on what forms of public spending they think are important, and they get to pressure politicians. And so it's kind of a grassroots lobbying structure, for just lack of a better way of describing it. I don't know how many of those things could be done in countries other than Brazil, India, and Kenya. But I think you would get better results with that way of making decisions rather than the one where gunmen stand in front of executives who stand in front of shareholders. And the more of those kinds of other forms of making decisions that we try, the less destructive, I would guess, and I would hope, the decisions that get made about what to do with resources and economic development and social justice.
No, thank you for that. And but again, and any of one of you could take it, because the people of Kosawa do try a lot. They do really try. They organize. They are at it throughout the book. They try different means. They try to reach out to their local authorities. They go all the way to the Capitol. They go all the way to the courts in America, and they're unable to, to bring about change. And I don't want to really ruin the book for anyone who hasn't read it. And so again, what happens when those social structures, when the social structures, but also the political structures and the governance structures fail to meet the needs of the people, what is their next? What is their recourse? And Mbola, I don't know if you're planning a sequel to this. We are giving you too many books to write now.
Yeah, I think Jamila already had the idea for my next book, so maybe I'll do that one. I think that, because people ask me, and I think that, I think Femi and Jamila are better positioned to answer that question, because people ask me all the time, like, what should they do? What do people in that situation do, right? In this book, there's a lot of failure. These people recognize that they do have power to fight, because in the beginning, when the book starts, they just sit in there, oh, what can we do? How can we fight this big oil company? And then they realize that they can, but without giving away the ending, it's very complicated, right? And I am a novelist. I don't have ideas the way fellow esteemed panelists do. So I wonder myself, right? What do people do when their backs against the wall? And then that brings up the issue of violence, because that is a question I get asked a lot about violence. There's a lot of violence being used on both sides in this novel. And am I suggesting that it's okay to use violence? No, I'm not suggesting that, but also it's a bunch of questions that I'm trying to ask. That what can we do? And for me personally, I think that we cannot sit back and just let governments or the corporations, be responsible. I think that we all have to take some kind of responsibility for what is happening all over the world. That we all have to sort of, join the environmental movement or join the climate change movement in whatever way that we can, because none of this is isolated. What is happening in a fictional place like Kosawa it has to do with us and our choices in America, our choices in Europe, wherever we are. And so we live in such a global world, like we saw with COVID, right? COVID started in Wuhan, China, and next thing you know, people are having it in South Africa and having it all over the world. So I think that for me, it has to do with me sort of questioning my own complicity, right? How complicit I am in the choices I make that allow these things to happen in other parts of the world. But as far as what else could be done, yes, I rather, I'm curious to hear what Femi and Jamila would have to say about that.
Femi, Jamila, who wants to go first?
So since I'm unmuted, let me say, Imbolo, as someone who's now leading a planetary health center, it really, what you said was spot on. How do we just have to live differently. The choices we make as consumers, as people who, the choices we make in how we consume, how we produce, how we develop economically is going to be critical. And as long as there's demand, there will be supply. But that's one. But the second thing is, how do we hold these people accountable? And I think that activism, that anger must continue. And alongside, some very clever ways that we engage that, we'll have to use both diplomatic tracks as well as showing the business case, right? So for me, why this book is so important for me is that, this is my everyday struggle, right? Running a planetary health center, to say, what is the cost of us doing nothing? The costs in terms of lives is one thing, but what is the economic cost? Because the policy will make those decisions not based on whether they care about you, but because of the economic impact. So I think, it requires a multi-track approach, right? But the anger must persist. But, what do we do? Do we give up? Because, looking at this report today, it makes me really depressed. But I look at young people now, and they are aware. We have a woke society, right? In the sense that they know our generation, have now destroyed their future, essentially. So how do we encourage the younger generation? I think we also have to be very careful that we might be in an echo chamber, right? We are the ones who understand, but there are other people who probably don't know and don't care about what's going on. So I think the long route, if we have time, is really education and advocacy. And I think using culture, art, literature to really wake people up. But the only challenge is we don't have much time. This is our biggest challenge.
Yeah, the time is a big challenge too. But I also think that the way that we think about social and political change also has to shift. And that's one of the things I thought was valuable about the book. There's a part early on, I believe it's Tula's father, who says, are the people over there in the Capitol, are they not human beings? Do they not understand, what it is for a child to die, to have to bury a child? And is reasoning through that as the reason to try to appeal to their conscience. And, we all know how that went, right? Like at the end of the day, I don't think we should ignore our own complicity or ignore our consumer habits, reuse, recycle, all of that. But the decisions at scale are being made by the kind of people that launched the Iraq War, the kind of people that create statistics like hundreds of thousands of people dead and just see no problem with it, right? So there is indeed an echo chamber that we're in, we could call it, where we're aware of climate change and we have a problem with it. But there's also people who are aware of climate change and who are just determined to do something they've succeeded at doing for the last few decades, and indeed the last few hundred years, which is just making sure that it's other people's children who die as a result of environmental destruction. That is the history of colonialism. And that is not a position we can appeal our way out of at the level of persuasion or at the level of moral appeals. So I think, again, I'm with Tonga. Tonga understands that, it's going to be something outside of the realm of regular persuasion that changes the political reality. I think, what people should be thinking about is not changing their consumer habits, but changing their political habits. What are the kinds of organization, what are the kinds of political activities that can make the sort of people who are willing to kill other human beings by the hundreds of thousands do something different than they have already planned to do? Historically, We've seen that workers' unions, tenants' unions, debtors' unions, these kinds of forms of organizing that have leverage that can say, if you don't do the thing that we want, we're going to deny you a thing that you want. Those are the kinds of forms of organizations that can change the minds of powerful people. And I think those are the things we should be thinking of first and foremost when we are asked questions about what to do, because those are the only, that's the direction of answers that I think we have a reason historically to try first.
So I think, so Femi, I guess you're suggesting that the answer lies at the ballot box, right? Like democracy, electing a democratic no, okay, sorry, I just wanted to understand.
Well, it depends who's running. I guess okay, I shouldn't say no so categorically. In Brazil, maybe that's the answer, right? Because somebody from the Workers' Party is running for president and indeed just won. Right. So I shouldn't say no so categorically. I think the ballot box can be a measure, but there has to be political power behind whatever the alternative to fossil fueled capitalism that we're going to have. And there's lots of ways to build power, and many of those don't involve a ballot box, or at least not the regular kind of ballot box, right? Forming a union or strengthening a union or changing the political direction of a union, or getting together with people that all owe debt to the same people, or all pay utility bills to the same energy business, or as the Ogoni people were doing against Shell, sabotaging their operations. But you have to do something that communicates to them in a language they understand, which unfortunately is not persuasion. And I don't think most countries have an electoral process that is serious enough and that is, challengeable enough to make that plan A, or to make that the entire plan of what people should do politically.
No, and that's very great. I mean, I wrote down quite a lot of things. I was, as Mbolu was speaking earlier, I was thinking about this idea of complicity, and really thinking, because I see a lot of actions we are asked to take, that are not really, maybe they make our lives a little harder. I don't know, walk instead of taking a car. Don't print if you don't need to. But then, as I was listening to you, and I'm like, yeah, we can do all of these things. But at the heart of all of these things is really who's making the decision. So I always feel like no matter how much I recycle, who's making the decisions that are actually at the core of what we are discussing right now? And whose interests do they have in mind when they're making all of these decisions?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that, not that it is directly related, and I completely agree with what Femi said, that, it has to do with, because, I mean, in the case of, I don't know, like in the novel, for example, like, they didn't really have a choice at the ballot box, right? I grew up in a dictatorship, my country is still a dictatorship. If you go vote, we still get the same dictator. It doesn't matter what the ballot box says. But I do think that, and I don't know what said, it has to do with demand and supply. And for me, and I don't have answers. All I have is questions. But I think about the fact that, let's think about like slavery. Why did slavery go on for so long? Because people wanted their sugar, people wanted their cotton, right? I mean, yes, lots of other issues going on there. But I'm saying that if we were to, not that it's going to solve anything, but for me that, I think that if you're in, Jamila's position, you are more, hands-on, and you're more at the forefront. But for people like me, who all we think about is what can I do on a personal level? I am more inclined to ask myself about how complicit I am, because the fact is that a lot of us hear these stories happening all over the world and we say, oh, well, we don't really think about it. Or even the news that we got today from the UN, we don't really think about it, like how, how this is going to affect me later, how it's going to affect my children later. And I think it has to do with sort of really getting closer to the story, and which is where fiction, it does a better job at that than, I don't know, than the news, for example. Because if you hear on the news, 50 people were killed in the Amazon today, you wouldn't really think about it. But if you were to read a novel, it's said there and you think about it, then it's a whole different situation to you. And so I talk about being complicit only because it's a bigger issue than most of us can handle on our day-to-day. But to Femi's point, we can do a lot about our own governments if we can, right? We can do a lot about pushing, for communities and countries where more people have a voice, because that is a problem that is going on, is that not enough people have a voice to get to say what they really want. I mean, if you look at what was happening in Kusawa, they didn't have any voice, and that is what happened. So if we could push for a situation where more people can have a say on what kind of country they like to live in, what kind of world they like to live in, then I think that we all stand a better chance.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to read a question that came in from the Discord channel, and any of you can take it. And this is a question around, like, how do we reconcile the tensions between economic development and environmental sustainability in the context of developing nations?
That is way above my pay grade.
Ruth, can you repeat?
Yes, how do we reconcile the tensions between economic development and environmental sustainability in the context of development nations? And as I let you think about the questions, I can maybe just ramble a little bit. Because one of the things as well that comes up a lot, particularly around climate change, we see the impact in many developing nations. And yet at the same time I'm from Uganda myself, by the way, and a lot of these countries, if you look at, we have a big drought in Somalia, that is really fueled by climate change, the Pakistan floods last year. I mean, I could go down the list. And a lot of these countries are really saying we are not responsible for, we're not driving climate change. So there is that question. At the same time, these countries want to develop as well, and they're being asked not to do some of the things that other, developed nations have already benefited from. So I'm hoping this is where maybe one of those questions is coming from.
I want to respond to this. It so happens I am in the UK to visit a program in Birmingham where they're looking at regenerative economics, and I think some of you may be familiar with the donor economic model. So I think that the question is written that way because people still see economic development as a rise in GDP, whereas we should be looking at what does having a good life mean. Is it really just GDP growth? Because does GDP growth ensure that we address inequality and that everyone has access to services and access to a good life? And we've seen that, even with the pandemic recently, this is not the case. The inequity that is so stark, even within countries with high GDPs. So I think it requires us to fundamentally rethink development and really think about, regenerative economics that is not based on growth, but on equity and well-being. And only until you actually can disrupt the model of, what we think growth and development is, can we start to address, all the different challenges that we have.
Yeah, I would just to add a little to that. I think we should wonder if there is a tension between, developing whatever the demands of development and greening the economy, or at least if there's the same, if we should wonder what that connection is. Just speaking in the Nigerian case, in particular, the outcome of the discovery of petroleum and the political and economic decisions that followed were environmental devastation of the kind that Mbolo's book really well dramatizes. But alongside that, it was the destruction of a trajectory of economic development that was diversified, that had serious investment in airplanes and in the agricultural sector and in services, and that moved that economy towards an openly authoritarian, openly kleptocratic political mess. I don't think that's anyone's model of development, not even the neoliberals' model of development. But it's the kind of development that, Nigeria is not wholly exceptional. If you look at the case of Equatorial Guinea or Angola or the Gulf states, you see, with differing levels of competence, but you see regimes that are built around extraction and political elites and ruling class decisions that are built around extraction, and they produce fantastic wealth for a few people, but they don't produce, at least not reliably and not across the board, they don't produce developed economies in any sense of developed that includes more than the 1%. And so I think, that is the question of what it's going to take to actually, quote unquote, develop economies is one that the present political situation has not answered, particularly on the African continent. But I think even if you include some of the Asian success stories, it's a lot more complicated than you would think, especially if you look at the levels of inequality that have resulted from the kinds of, from the particular trajectories of development that we've had over the past 50 years or so, as Jamila was getting at. So I think, we have to ask new questions about development that are less tied to these measures like GDP growth that aren't very informative, if you ask me, and that ask more holistic questions about what people's life chances are and whether or not they have improved, and ask that at the level of whole populations and not aggregates of populations or statistical models of populations, but what are people's lives actually like?
And I have, of course, more questions, but I'm also now looking at the clock, and we are slowly coming up to the hour. And Mbolo, again, thank you so much for the gift of your book. But as we wind down, I do want to ask all of you who one or two of your favorite characters in the book and why?
Well, I'll go first because everybody already said it, so I pick it for Konga. Only because, I was, as a child, very fascinated by the idea of madness, by how we look at mentally ill people, and how they were dismissed. And even though Konga was not so much an attempt to explore mental illness, it was a way of taking another look at people who are not quote unquote normal like the rest of us. And so I always, growing up, we had people like Konga walking around the place, and I never really thought much. But as I started writing this book, I thought, what do they know? What do they see that the rest of us don't, because we are too busy being sane? And I also like the quote by the Burkinabe revolutionary Thomas Sankara, and he said that you cannot carry about fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. And that was a quote that I had at the bottom of my email for many years, because I thought, yes, you know, that's what it takes. It takes a certain amount of madness to do something, to stand up and dare to see what other people are not seeing. Other people are going, oh, what can we do? And he's saying, oh, we can kidnap them. Not the best idea in the world, but at least he got things moving. And my other favorite character, of course, is Tula, you know, because she was the very first character that I conceived when I got the inspiration to write this novel. And again, this, like I said earlier, this was an attempt to pay homage to people like Jamil and Femi, who are on the ground, and all of the other environmentalists and activists and thinkers who are on the ground doing this work. Like, all I get to do is tell their story, but they actually are doing the work. And I always had this deep admiration for that. And so Tula was inspired by lots of different activists and revolutionaries and environmentalists. And I sort of, a lot of them were men, and I put them in a woman. But you know, she's the kind of woman that I look at and thinking, oh my God, when I grow up, I want to be like you, you know, because she's just so everything fascinating. And it was difficult writing a lot of scenes that involved her, but I knew I had to be honest in my portrayal of her. But overall, it was definitely a joy writing that character.
Thank you, Mbolu, for that. Femi? Oh, Jamila, oh, sorry, go on.
No, Femi can go.
I'll just be quick. I also like Konga and Tula. So for the sake of just not duplicating, let me just add, I really, you know, I can't say it was my favorite character just because I didn't like his decisions, obviously. But I enjoyed reading, and I felt like I learned a lot from reading the portrayal of Wulja Becky. Because I think, you know, I think, you know, just to temper some of the stuff I myself said earlier, you know, I think there are some people who are just ghoulish and they're, you know, and they're terrible. And, you know, and I have no doubt that the Halliburtons and Shells of the world are full of such people. But I don't think that is how we should explain why these things in general work the way that they do. And what I found valuable about Wulja Becky is you can actually, you know, I think he was portrayed as a person, right? He's a person somewhere in the middle of a power hierarchy trying to figure out, you know, how he can best manage this complicated set of interests. And he has a little bit of power, but, you know, the Paxton people have more. And, you know, I found him very human. And I found that to be one of the strengths of the book. You know, it wasn't this, you know, kind of children's villains and heroes story. It was, you know, how do people respond to these situations? So I like that.
Thank you, Jamila.
Yeah, I think we all love Konga, right? And Tula, but I also loved her grandmother.
Yes.
I thought that, you know, here was a woman who was so wise, so calm, so forgiving and loving, and you know, always I felt she was the stabilizing factor in the family in so many ways. So, and I thought that chapter was written so beautifully, and you know, often you forget, you know, the older women in community that have so much to offer, and they're quiet because that's how the society is, but they're the wisdom that they have, and her ability to see beyond the, you know, the brash character of her husband, and able to embrace him with so much love, because she was able to see the beauty in him, you know, and the pain he had gone through. So I thought that was a really interesting character, and something that I think we see in our everyday lives, that, you know, women who have to to bear, some really horrific men, but who are able to see beyond, what we see, right?
Thank you so much,
I just want to
Jamila.
add one,
Yes.
because everybody mentioned Tula and Konga, just a little tidbit that when I started writing this novel, I was, I don't know, 1 million, I started writing in 2002, many, many years ago. Konga and Tula were actually one character. So it was in the process of writing that I actually made them two separate characters. So it was a bit complicated, but they used to be, Konga was Tula, Tula was Konga, and then over the course of 17 years of writing the novel, they became two different people. So maybe that is why anybody who likes one likes the other, because they started off as the same person.
Oh, wow. Wow. Mbolo, thank you so much for your book. As you can see, we really, really loved the book. As you can see, it's just opened up this door for us to have really conversations about people who are really at the brunt of what's going on in these situations. Femi, thank you so much for your time. And Jamila, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your gift of time. And please enjoy the rest of your evenings or your day, whatever you do. And thank you, participants, for joining us.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.